Hello and welcome to the Kitchen Table Theology podcast, where each week Pastor Jeff Cranston explores biblical theology that provides practical life applications in an understandable way. Thanks for joining us at the table. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Kitchen Table Theology. I'm your host, Tiffany Coker. Along with my dad, Pastor Jeff Cranston, we're seeking not only to help you know deep, solid biblical theology, but to know the Word of God and the promises of God that are given to us in His Word, all while holding to solid theological truths in your heart, soul, and mind. Before we get started today, I want to take just a second and say thank you again, our listeners, for leaving us ratings and reviews. We're so grateful because that is really what helps us get the word out to others to hear about Kitchen Table Theology. So if you have a second today, take a moment and leave us a rating or review, and we really appreciate it. In today's podcast, we're getting to hear a story of redemption, of hope, one of kindness and obedience, with a little bit of a love story thrown in there. The Old Testament book that we're diving into today is the book of Ruth. So beginning with episode number 143, we have now discussed and studied, including today's podcast, 16 Old and New Testament books so far, along with their theological themes. So if you've missed any of those, we encourage you to go back and give them a listen.
Hello again, Kitchen Table Theologians. Thanks always for joining us. And we really do appreciate, as Tiff said, your support, your encouragement. And I just want to say that we trust that the podcast is a help to you, not only in gaining some biblical knowledge, but in knowing your Father God in a deeper way. Today, we'll look into one of my favorite Old Testament books, the book of Ruth. I love the book of Ruth.
I do too. It is a great one. Such a good story, but so much depth to it also. Dad, I'm trying to remember, but I feel like you preached a sermon series on Ruth a couple years ago.
Yeah, that couple of years ago was 4 years ago.
Seems like just yesterday.
I think I've preached through Ruth twice, and the other time was many years ago. But because I was wondering the same thing, and I looked it up earlier, and it was the summer of 2019, and we called the series "The Power of Small," and it's on the Low Country Community Church website, I think. I guess it will still be up.
We'll challenge you to find it.
Yeah, if it's not there.
It should be.
And if it's not there and you want to hear it, let me know and we'll try to help you.
So yes, Ruth, it's a tiny little book. It's only 4 chapters. It is slipped into the Old Testament between the books of Judges and 1 Samuel. So at face value, the book of Ruth really just looks like a short, self-contained story, seemingly unconnected to most of what has occurred already in the Old Testament that we have been talking about. The tale begins not in Israel or in Judah that we would expect, but in Moab, where the Israelite Naomi and her husband Elimelech, her 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, I'm not sure if I'm saying that.
Let's pause right there and I'm giving you a round of applause for saying all those names properly.
Yes, yeah,
Mahlon and I just called them Mahlon and Chilion.
Mahlon and Chilion. I like it.
I don't know how to pronounce that.
Okay, so Naomi, her husband, and her 2 sons went to Moab when there was a famine in Judah. While they are there, her husband died, and her sons married Moabite women named Ruth and Orpah.
And then it gets really interesting. It's a book in which God is not often mentioned, hardly mentioned at all, but we see God's sovereign providential hand all throughout this story.
Right. So let's start with the basics. Who wrote the book of Ruth?
Before I answer that, can I tell a story, a true story? I'm going to, whether you said of course or not. World War II, as we all know, was a long, bloody conflict. And for the first 2 years of World War II, 1939 and 40, Great Britain fought the Axis powers alone, and it seemed on many days and nights certain not to survive. In 1941, President Roosevelt sent one of his most trusted advisors to Europe to get a sense of the situation. over there, and his name was Harry Hopkins. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was under immense domestic pressure not to enter the war. World War I was still fairly fresh. Just a little over 20 years earlier, we had been in World War I, so that was still fresh on people's minds. Most Americans did not want us getting involved in another European war. But Roosevelt knew that if Britain and Russia collapsed, the history of the world was going to be forever altered and in a very negative sense. So he sent Harry Hopkins, first of all, to Russia, and then he went to the United Kingdom. That's where Hopkins met with Winston Churchill. He was Great Britain's prime minister, and Hopkins was given a tour of the armed capabilities of the British Army. And his mission was to report back to President Roosevelt on how badly American intervention was needed. On the last night of his visit, the late historian Martin Gilbert, who wrote the seminal biography of Churchill, it's about 8 inches thick, and of course I've read it, but Gilbert tells us Churchill and Hopkins were given a dinner in Glasgow, Scotland, however you say it, by the regional commissioner of Scotland, a guy named Tom Johnson. After dinner, Hopkins said to Winston Churchill, and I'll quote, "I suppose you wish to know what I'm going to say to President Roosevelt on my return. I'm going to quote you one verse from that book of books. Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God." And then he very quietly added, "even to the end." And observers who were present saw the prime minister in tears. He knew what it meant. I just think that's an incredible story because Hopkins quotes the book of Ruth.
That really is incredible and just so powerful to think about that in the midst of a world war, one of the world's leading statesmen who he quoted from the book of Ruth. That is really a very cool story. Thanks for sharing.
So there's that little lead in. So who wrote the book? According to the Talmud, which is the Jewish tradition writings, the prophet Samuel wrote the book of Ruth. The book itself says nothing of the author, but whoever wrote it was a very skilled storyteller. It's been called by many one of the most beautiful short stories ever written.
We mentioned that the book feels just stuck in the middle of all of these other important historical books. Some people say it doesn't really fit in. So maybe you could help us explain to us where we are contextually in the Old Testament with this book of Ruth.
Yeah, that's a good observation and a good question. The events of Ruth occurred sometime between 1160 BC and 1100 BC. Kitchen Table Theology, give me just a second to get that in your timeline brain. 1160 to 1100 BC. This is during the latter period of the Judges when they were ruling over Israel. Now, these were dark days, and there was a lot of suffering that had been brought about by the Israelites' apostasy and their immorality. And part of the judgments God brought upon his sinful people included famine and war. And the book of Ruth opens with a report of famine. And that's what drove Naomi's family out of Bethlehem into neighboring Moab to begin with. They didn't have enough food to eat. Naomi eventually returned with Ruth because she heard, according to verse 6 of chapter 1, that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. In the midst of this national upheaval for Israel, God gives us a very personal story of how circumstances were affecting families and how he was still present in their lives. And the story stands as a beam of light. And it shows us or illustrates to us the power of the love between God and his people. So the author, whoever it is, maybe it is Samuel, gives you and I as readers a snapshot perspective. It's a vignette. We get one family in a small town at the threshing floor, as opposed to the broader narratives found in Judges and in 1st, 2nd Samuel and in 1st and 2nd Kings.
Since it's a more personal story, as you're telling us, about people, who do we need to know from this book? Who are our main characters?
Yeah, there are a number of people mentioned, but let's just mention 4 main players. First of all, we've got Naomi. And as you said, Naomi was Elimelech's wife. When we meet her, she's a widow. And she's one of the 2 most important characters in the book of Ruth. Naomi's life was a real struggle for most of the book of Ruth. First, she fled from her homeland due to famine. Then her husband died. And if that wasn't enough, soon after, both of her sons died as well. This leaves her bereft of husband and sons, totally impoverished. And Naomi decided to return home. And guess where she lived? Bethlehem. Isn't that a coincidence?
Quite.
And she warned her daughters-in-law. She had Orpah and Ruth, warned them. She said, look, basically, I can't provide for you, and you should return to the homes of your fathers. So go back there. Now, Naomi's name, the name Naomi means pleasantness. But when she returned to Bethlehem, she was a different woman from the woman who left Bethlehem. So she returned in grief, and she rejected her name Naomi. And she told everybody to call her Mara, which means bitter. But don't worry, the story does eventually have a happy ending.
So we have Naomi, and then there's Ruth.
Yep, Ruth. Ruth was born in Moab, a country just across the Dead Sea from where the Jews lived. Now, Ruth's husband had died, and she decided to go to Israel with her mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth's name means friend or companion, which clearly fits her perfectly in this story.
Yes, it does. As the story unfolds, she meets a man, they fall in love, they live happily ever after. His name is
Boaz. Boaz is described as a prominent, wealthy man and a kinsman. That means in some way, shape, or form, he's related to Naomi's family. And Boaz meets Ruth when she's gleaning in his field, and he's in awe of Ruth's generosity and love toward Naomi, her mother-in-law, and Boaz fell very quickly for Ruth. So conveniently, as a relative of Elimelech, so Ruth, former husband who has died, Boaz is
Naomi's husband.
Oh, yes. Thank you for that catch. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, who has died, is somehow related to Boaz. And now, due to biblical laws of what's called levirate marriage, Boaz had a responsibility toward Naomi and Ruth.
We're going to need you to pause right there. What is levirate marriage? I don't think we know that term today.
Okay, so that's spelled Levirate, levirate marriage. That's a great question. Levirate marriage is the obligation of a surviving brother to marry the widow of his brother if he died without having sired children. So if you're a man and your brother dies married and leaves a widow but has no children, levirate marriage, and this is in the Levitical law, it's in the Old Testament law, you had a responsibility to marry your former brother's wife. The corollary is that the widow, also according to this law, must marry a brother-in-law rather than anyone outside the family. Now, the oldest of the surviving brothers had the first obligation to do this, which also allowed him to inherit all of his dead brother's property, everything that he had, everything that he had owned.
All right. Looking at that law through the lens of the 21st century, it's hard, I think, maybe for us to see the rationale behind it. So why did God command this?
Yeah, it's hard.
Just a little bit.
There's a lot of men listening right now that are like, man, am I so glad I'm not under levirate law anymore. And there's a lot of women thinking the same thing.
The same thing.
So the explicit purpose of this command was to have the surviving brother produce an heir to perpetuate the name of his dead brother, so that it would not be, as the law says, the name would not be blotted out of Israel. But Boaz sets his sight on Ruth, says he wasn't bound by levirate law to marry Naomi. And apparently, this is why this should be an HBO series or a movie or something.
It's quite the story.
There may have been a closer relative than Boaz was, who could have married Ruth first. And apparently, and I think as you read through Ruth, you get this idea. She was a very attractive young lady, but Boaz was like, man, I've got to marry her. So after a short, honest, semi-friendly confrontation with a closer relative, Boaz ends up marrying Ruth, much to the delight of Naomi, and they have a son together named Obed. And Obed becomes the grandfather of Israel's greatest king, David. By the way, Boaz means in him there is strength. And I think that's an appropriate name as well.
We learn something new every day. That is for sure. Levirate marriage. Good for us to know. Glad we don't still have that law today. But let's get back to our main characters here. We have one left. Boaz and Ruth had a son, and I think you said they named him Obed.
Yeah, real quick. Obed brings a sense of security back into Naomi's life, a feeling she had not probably known since her husband had been alive. The name Obed means one who serves. And if you think about it, Obed had a very fitting role. And it was, even as a child, even as a baby, to nourish and comfort Naomi, his grandmother. He came into her life. She had lost her sons. Now she has a grandson. Imagine what that must have meant to her. She's probably volunteering to babysit all the time.
All the time.
Yep. So Obed eventually grows up, and he has a son named Jesse. And Jesse will eventually have a son who will become the father of King David.
Pretty cool storyline there. So let's turn to some of the themes that we find in this book. So can you bring us up to date on some of the theological themes that run throughout the book of Ruth?
Yeah, sure. And let's start with the theme of blessing. Blessing is the asking for or the giving of God's favor. It's very important, this concept of blessing throughout biblical history. We see people seeking blessings, even pulling the wool over their own father's eyes to receive his patriarchal blessing. You might recall the story when Isaac was tricked into blessing Jacob instead of the firstborn son Esau. Mm-hmm. You can move to the New Testament, where at the Last Supper, Jesus offered a blessing over the bread and the wine. And to be blessed is to be favored by God. Blessings occur 7 times in this little book of Ruth. From Naomi blessing both her daughter-in-laws in chapter 1, to Naomi blessing Boaz, to Boaz blessing his workers. And there's an even deeper blessing of Ruth, and climatically to the women blessing the Lord for the birth of Obed. And these blessings point out how God works in the lives of people and how he works in history. But the theme or the concept of blessing is of major importance throughout both the Old and the New Testaments.
All right, you told me earlier, before we started to record this, that there's a theological theme found in every chapter of this book. Why don't we take the 4 chapters chronologically, and you can tell us the theme for each one briefly?
Yeah, very briefly. Chapter 1, you see the theme of faithfulness. You'll recall Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem, told Ruth and Orpah, go back to Moab, go back to your father's house. Orpah chooses to do that. Ruth, however, clings to Naomi and follows the God of Israel. And you know what that meant? That meant giving up her Moabite gods, because they had their own gods. So she gave that up. She gave up her culture. She gave up her people. She gave up her family. She gave up her language. Faithfulness. And of course, this reminds us that this is an attribute of God. The hymn writer said it very well, right? Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. Chapter 1, faithfulness.
It is very easy to see that theme of faithfulness in this book. We have blessings and we have faithfulness. What does chapter 2 tell us?
Sovereignty. Naomi returns to Bethlehem, a very bitter woman, thinking God is her enemy because of her losses, 2 sons, a husband. But God has plans she doesn't know about, which begin to unfold when Ruth volunteers to pick up the grain in the fields left behind by the harvesters, called gleaning. And such gleaning was permitted to provide for the poor. In the Old Testament law, it tells the owners of these fields, when you're chopping down the wheat or harvesting the wheat, that you leave some on the outside and in the corners of your field for the poor people to come. And that's what Ruth was doing, and Boaz saw her. So in God's sovereign plan and his providence, Ruth entered the field of Boaz. Again, he's a relative. She doesn't know that. Boaz had heard of Ruth's faithfulness toward Naomi, and he was asking questions about her. And he gave instructions to his workers to leave really good grain behind so that this would provide for Ruth and Naomi. And so you see God's sovereign hand and what he was doing to bring all of this together.
Blessings, faithfulness, God's sovereignty. That's a lot already, and we're only halfway through the book. How about in chapter 3?
There's a lot there, but I think we could say faith. We see faith in God's plan. Over a period of several months, Ruth willingly works in Boaz's fields to provide for her, and Naomi repays Ruth's kindness by devising a plan that will force Boaz to make a serious decision about Ruth. Ruth is instructed by Naomi to engage in what the law demands. So she's to go to Boaz and ask him to take her for his wife in the place of her dead husband because she is a close relative. And this takes place at night on a threshing floor during the harvest. So Ruth put on some perfume. I think it was called Midnight at Moab.
Stop.
That's terrible. No, that's terrible. I don't know what it's called. But anyhow, Ruth goes in and makes this proposal, and he accepts, and throwing a garment over her, that was some proof of the acceptance of that. Different, but it required faith in God's sovereign purpose and plan for Ruth to do that and for Naomi to encourage her to do that.
For sure. Okay, finally, chapter 4.
Yeah, let's just call this reward. But Boaz agrees to marry Ruth as part of the Levirate marriage laws. But he reveals to her the next morning, he says, I got to talk to another man because I think he's a closer relative, and to see if he wants to fulfill the Levirate custom. So how or why, we don't know, but that man declines. That opens the door for Boaz to marry Ruth. So God blesses Ruth's faithful devotion by giving her a husband in Boaz and a son, Obed, who would later be the grandfather to David and whose ultimate ancestor, it goes all the way down the bloodline to who? To Jesus Christ.
Talk about the ultimate reward.
Yeah.
There.
So, yeah, that's it, the ultimate reward. And so in wrapping this up, the book of Ruth gives us an important analogy of the work of Christ, because there are parallels to Christ in the book, like Boaz. Jesus is related to us by his physical birth, able to pay the price of redemption, willing to redeem, able to redeem. And like Ruth, you and I have to choose to accept redemption and leave that transaction to Jesus, who makes it all a reality. The book of Ruth takes place, as I said at the beginning, during very spiritually dark days in Israel's history, the days of the judges. And Ruth is a story of a woman who lives during that evil period in Israel's history, but doesn't succumb to its moral decay. And her story is one of integrity and righteousness and faithfulness. And that story, by the way, that we read in those 4 chapters, covers about 11 to 12 years. and shows how her faithfulness to follow the God of Israel leads to great blessing, not only for her, but also for Naomi and for Boaz, and ultimately for the world, because Ruth is in the blood lineage of Jesus Christ. And so as we wrap up today's podcast, it's good to be reminded that Christians belong to a loving, faithful, powerful, sovereign God who has never, ever failed to care and provide for his children. And like Ruth and Boaz, we're called to respond to that divine grace in faithful obedience in spite of the godless culture in which we live. And so the only question I think that remains is, are we willing to do that in the lives that we lead?
I think that's a great place to stop and wrap it up here today. Thank you so much for listening, Kitchen Table Theologians. You can always check out the episode notes for more information. And we do want to recommend one book for you today. It's entitled Ruth, a Discourse Analysis of the Hebrew Bible. It's written by Daniel Block. So we'll put all the details on that book for you in the show notes. You can check it out there. Also, you can always visit jeffcranston.com for more information. We want to take just a second and thank our friends at Low Country Community Church here in Bluffton, South Carolina, as well as the wonderful people at Streamline Podcast for making this podcast possible. Next week, we're going to dive into the New Testament book of 2 Corinthians. We also have a Q&A podcast coming up soon. So go ahead, submit your questions. We need them. You can email us at pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org.
And let me just encourage you to send in the questions. We have hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of listeners. We have received 0 questions. We know you have questions. And go ahead, pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org. And we would love to answer, or at least try to answer, the questions that you submit.
Yes, we also have a quiz coming up soon. I know you guys love those types of episodes, so be on the lookout for that in the next few weeks. But like I said, next week will be the New Testament book of 2 Corinthians. Until then, remember, the real power of theology is not only knowing it, but applying it.